Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jo Clifford's play, The Tree of Life. So this is a very cool play. It's premised on the idea that David Hume and Adam Smith, philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment, come back to life-ish, some version of life, afterlife, something like this, in contemporary Scotland. They see essentially a world kind of built out of their philosophies in many ways. There's actually a book called How the Scots Invented the Modern World, I think, and it's a book-length exploration of the idea that the Scottish Enlightenment, people like Hume and Smith, were so influential as thinkers, were so important as thinkers to the shaping of the modern world, that the Scottish Enlightenment can be argued to be the key event for building the world that we know today. So Clifford kind of picks up on that idea and puts these two philosophers in a contemporary capitalist Scotland. Interestingly enough, a Scotland that is capitalist but also has the welfare state. So we've got these sort of interesting tensions because, of course, Adam Smith is the key philosopher of market capitalism, and the idea that the world will be best built when the forces of the free market are unconstrained by governmental regulations. It would be interesting to see how Smith would have reacted had this play been set in, say, late 19th century Glasgow. I mean, Victorian factories, Victorian slums, etc., were relatively horrific, and they were the results of free market capitalism. But when you come into 21st century Scotland, the 21st century United Kingdom, you have a kind of capitalism tempered by the welfare state. So the National Health Service exists. It consistently, generally, does a better job than the private insurance market, for instance, that we have here in the United States, the for-profit healthcare system in the US. It's not the market economy. The market economy has provided a poorer outcome. So there's those elements of it. And Hume was one of the big philosophers of skepticism. This idea that we should be distrustful of anything not directly observed. And even when something is directly observed, we should be skeptical about trusting it. So he had this sort of famous idea, in very basic terms, that just because the sun has risen every previous morning does not mean we should trust that it will rise tomorrow morning. So this idea of skepticism, this anti-religious sentiment, only faith in what the evidence tells you, rationalism, etc., has become a much bigger part of our lives than it was in, say, 17th, 18th, and 19th century Britain, Scotland. So there's that, but there's also, one of the things that Hume is confronted with is the fact that there are still slums, there is still poverty, there are still people who are alcoholics, who are poverty-stricken, who give all their money to, in the case of, the third character is named Eve, and she did a couple of different jobs in her lifetime. She worked making conductors in a very, very high-tech factory for 1976. She also made and sold silverware, etc. So she's done some different things. But her mother, she says, was a Scientologist and gave a lot of their money, even money that the family needed for food, to Scientology. So you've got these competing forces. And in a way, it's really like it is the exploration of the world built by the Scottish Enlightenment. I don't think that's overstating the case, since that's kind of Clifford's intended goal here. This idea that the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment envisioned a world of rationality, a world built on market forces, a world organized around reason and logic rather than superstition and arbitrary authority and things like this. And in many ways, the goals of the Scottish Enlightenment are admirable goals. They are fundamental components of the classical liberal project of people like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, etc., etc. These people who theorized individual liberty, equality before the law, things like this, individual rights, things like this. And yet, the world that is actually built out of these ideals is also a world full of exploitation, full of commodification of everything, including the human, as indeed Adam Smith finds out in this play. Basically, Smith kind of says, I spent my whole real, proper, previous life theorizing how the market would work, theorizing about life. Now I'm going to go live. And he basically just goes nuts. Basically, this is sort of Rumspringa is I think a decent comparison. In Amish communities, there's a tradition called Rumspringa, which, as I understand it, basically when an Amish person turns 18, they're sort of sent out into the world to determine whether or not they want to remain with the Amish, whether they want to remain in the community or whether they want to go out. And the idea basically is that like they go out and they do a bunch of drugs and they party and they have sex and they drink a lot and they do all these things that they aren't allowed to do among the Amish. And because it's such a full-on, like, visceral experience of drugs, sex, booze, etc., etc., it's an incredibly unpleasant and disjointing experience, in a way. And so the idea is that you go out and they give you a not necessarily accurate picture of and you get a not necessarily accurate picture of what life outside Amish communities is like. But because that is so unpleasant, you then come back to the community and say, no, this is what I want to do. This is a thing that makes sense to me. That's essentially what Adam Smith kind of gets here. He grew up with a very strict Calvinist mother, and he was probably gay, at least according to Clifford. I don't know that much about Adam Smith personally. There were a lot of gay men throughout history, a lot of gay women as well, although these, I think for women there was more flexibility in some ways. I don't know, it's beside the point. A lot of closeted gay men throughout history. Adam Smith had, as far as I know, no sexual life whatsoever. So he wakes up, he's like, well, fuck it. I'm going to go do all the stuff that I always secretly wanted to do. So he goes out and he goes to a techno club and he does ecstasy. He hooks up with somebody via a hookup app. And it's interesting because, let me see if I can find this bit. Yeah, so Smith's hookup is really, really interesting because he finds this guy online, goes to meet him, and then when he returns, he's incredibly distraught by the experience. Basically, what he says is there was no tenderness, there was no human connection. And this is one of the things. He's like, Adam Smith, for as much as opponents of capitalism tend to characterize somebody like Adam Smith as maybe technocratic or just sort of interested in the forces of the market, the function of the market, Smith actually was much more of an ethical philosopher than many later capitalist thinkers would be. So the neoliberals, for instance, people like Sidney Friedman, for instance, are much less concerned with how do we build a good ethical society in which people are connecting with one another. That was actually important to Adam Smith. And so we get this very interesting bit here. He comes back from this encounter, and he basically recounts that this guy refused to really look at him. The guy had said he was planning to have sex with 15 people that day, and Smith was number 12. And there's this bit here. The theory is our fellow feeling for each other, our sympathy. That's what should govern our arrangement of society. That the relationship between buyer and seller, being based on mutual advantage, will deepen and develop our common humanity. The theory of moral sentiments. I was proud of it. Why was he so cold? Perhaps Mother was right. Perhaps all this is wickedness. There's something wrong. There's something wrong. I've never encountered anyone so cold. He becomes aware of the audience. Stage direction. Why aren't you happier when you have so much? What's wrong with him? So cold. So very cold. Can I buy tenderness? And I think that's really a revealing element of this. Like, kind of the ultimate question of the tree of knowledge, I think, is how do we navigate a world so full of contradictions? And what would the people who gave us the foundations of that world make of it? How would someone like Adam Smith or David Hume understand or engage with or even begin to comprehend the world that we live in, a world where free market forces have created incredible production of goods and services and yet have commodified the human, have turned humans more into machines than we ever were, more into things to be bought and sold than we ever were in the pre-capitalist era. How would someone like Hume understand a world in which science and rationality and reason and knowledge are central to what makes our societies run, and yet we have conspiracy theories, we have these religions that take masses of people's money, we have all of these things that are easily solvable problems: poverty, homelessness, lack of access to medication, etc., etc. All of these things could be solved, and we don't solve them. What would somebody like David Hume, who believed in a rational order to society, that society was meant to benefit the people living in it, what would he make of our world? That's the central question of the tree of knowledge. And I guess ultimately, maybe, the question is, would we want to know?